As we stand on the eve of war with Iraq, many questions and issues remain unanswered. Our focus today is on the consequences of war, both for the region, for Iraq, and for the United States.
I've been asked to speak about the regional consequences of what looks like an inevitable war against Iraq. And in thinking about what I wanted to say, it struck me that there's some very real differences between the way I thought about this issue in 1991 during the first Gulf War and the way I think about it now. And I just wanted to share with you two of the things that occurred to me. The first one is that in 1991 there was a great deal of talk about the Arab street, about possible popular resistance against a war in Iraq. And what strikes me today is the silence of the Arab street. In fact, it's been remarkable that as the anti-war movement has taken off well ahead of the war all over the globe, and there have been demonstrations everywhere in a very unified way, there have been almost no spontaneous demonstrations of any size in any of the Arab countries. In fact, Iran and Turkey, surprisingly, have had the most demonstrations and the largest ones. What this suggests to me is that there is a disconnection of the public from the public realm in the Arab world. This does not suggest support for the war, but rather, I believe, an anti-American sentiment that is probably at its height. Daily, people in the Arab world witness the slaughter of Palestinians and connect it with U.S. complicity and support for Israel. They daily observe and comment upon the hypocrisy of international institutions as they confront different kinds of conflicts in the Middle East. They daily see on television the suffering of Iraqi women and children under the sanctions regime. This is a region that is racked by a severe economic crisis and has been experiencing a decline in standard of living. There's a hopelessness and a sense of anger at the incompetence of the leadership, but actually no sense of what the alternatives might be. This is a culture, I believe, of silence and of victimhood that has no recourse. And as I was even thinking about this, it was a very frightening thought to me. The second thing that struck me was that as I've done research in the Middle East, I've always been told that something like, we love the American people, but we have problems with the policies of the government. This is no longer the message that one gets when traveling either in the Middle East or the Arab world, or even places like Turkey that are considered to be allies and are members of NATO. And I think that it's here that we can contemplate the real message of 9/11, which was essentially that the American people are going to be held responsible for the actions of their government. And this is very hard for us, I think, as Americans to contemplate, because normally we leave foreign policy to the government and we don't pay very much attention. It's a truism that Americans tend to be very isolated from international events. All of this, of course, has to come to an end, and I think your presence here demonstrates that people are thinking very seriously about what's going on. So this combination of things, the silence of the Arab street, and that the American government and the American people are now in the same category for people in the region, suggests that maybe we shouldn't worry so much about the Arab street as about the Arab basement. The consequences of this war, in my opinion, are going to be widespread instability, statelessness of the kind that gave rise to the al-Qaeda network, and the best possible outcome that we can anticipate is a kind of a controlled anarchy that might make Afghanistan today in the post-war period look like a great military and political success. So how does the street turn into the basement? How does protest turn into quiet, random violence? This has nothing to do with the culture of the region. It has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with the policies that our government has pursued in the region. And I'd like to focus now on Iraq itself, and perhaps say some things that you're already familiar with, but I wasn't sure where to really pitch this. Even more than the Afghanistan that produced and hosted al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein is nothing if he is not made in America. And I say this very literally. Starting with the 1963 coup that first brought the Baathists to power in Iraq against the communists that the Americans at the time thought of as a threat, through the direct promotion of Saddam Hussein himself during the Iranian Revolution and after the Iranian Revolution, into the Reagan years when Ronald Rumsfeld himself regularly met with Saddam Hussein, and there's some wonderful pictures on the net. If you're proficient in this technology, you can find them. And onto our knowledge of his use of poison gas in Halabja in 1988, we can see that our complicity, our government's complicity in creating this regime and creating this leader that everybody recognizes as being monstrous, is long-standing, constant, and continuous. The chronology sort of continues. Even after the 1991 war, when there was an opportunity to change this regime, when already casualties had been suffered and there was a general opportunity, the government first made the decision to keep Hussein in power, fearing that there would be a civil war, and then provided the Republican Guard air cover as they massacred Shiite rebels that the United States government had encouraged to rise up against Saddam and his Republican Guard. Iraqis know all of this. They've lived through this. What I mean to say by suggesting that they're conscious of all of this involvement with the regime is that I don't believe that we're going to be welcomed as liberators. I think it's possible to go practically anywhere in the world and get one or two people to say, you know, we want the Americans to come in, but I don't think that this is the case, even in Kurdistan. Sorry, I didn't mean to say Kurdistan. I meant northern Iraq. There is no doubt that the United States can triumph militarily if that means destroying whatever is left of the Iraqi army. The Iraqi GDP today is less than 2% of the U.S. military budget. 1.5 million Iraqis died as a result of the sanctions. And Iraq is today governed by a host of tribes, commissions, UN delegates, and so on, that really represents a complete fragmentation of authority. What this means is there's really no unified authority to take over from. This is not Germany or Japan after World War II. What it suggests is that if this war happens, which seems likely, it's going to look a lot more like Afghanistan than it's going to look like Germany or Japan after the war. So what are the challenges for the United States in a post-war Iraq, and how should we start thinking about these in advance? Given that, as I've suggested, our well-being now, after 9/11, is directly at stake, and the well-being of our children. The first point I'd like to talk about, which I think is the most important one, and something that you're all familiar with, is the ethnic diversity and the religious diversity of Iraq. The Shiites in the south, bordering Iran, are in and in control of the cities of Najaf and Karbala, the two holiest sites of Shiite Islam. They have very strong ties historically with Shiites in Iran. There are the Kurds in the north, who, of course, as you all know, have at various times had actual practical political and military aims to unite with the Kurds in Turkey and elsewhere. There's the Christian community, which is a very privileged community centered in Baghdad mostly, but a community that is widely resented by the rest of the population precisely because the Ba'athist regime has used it as a prop and as a political ally in its other methods of rule. This diversity obviously comes as a result of the borders that were drawn by the British and the French with the explicit aim of weakening Iraq and making sure that it did not become a dominant power that could not be controlled, particularly by the British. So what you have here is a situation with a country that is rich in resources, rich in talent, rich in population, where persistent problems of state building and control have essentially led to the kind of regime that we see today. Now, this regime didn't come, as I suggested earlier, out of thin air, but through a series of historical accidents combined with eventual U.S. support that brought to power a very small group of Sunni army officers that were drawn from particular parts of the country, particular regions, particular cities, in some cases even particular families and clans. So Iraq had, over time, since the Baathists gained control eventually in 1967, become increasingly centralized and had established some measure in a very brutal fashion, of course, because there was all kinds of intrigue going on both within the country and outside, had established some measure of stability. The rule was a draconian rule supported by oil and later supported by ample flows of arms from the United States, the Europeans, and the Soviet Union. This system of centralized rule really came undone in 1991 and subsequent to that. With the no-fly zones, which essentially demark the Shiite and the Kurdish segments of the country, you've had the emergence of alternative authorities that base themselves on a variety of different patronage links, clan alliances, and so on, so that you have a situation where not only do you have fragmented authority, but you no longer have a centralized, unified national market. A variety of currencies hold sway in Iraq, as was the case prior to World War I. Now, what does this mean for a war effort? What it means, essentially, is that in addition to preventing large-scale massacres and bloodletting that has to do with revenge for past misdeeds and so on, that the problem of getting the different groups together that are actually on the ground is going to be enormous. There was an idea, as the United States tried recently in Afghanistan, and I think Afghanis, being one of the poorest people in the world, can be bought off much more easily than Iraqis. There was this idea that essentially the flow of resources from the United States occupying forces to different groups would prevent this kind of bloodletting, that everybody could be brought together. Well, that hasn't happened in Afghanistan, and I would say that it wouldn't happen here. And it would be a very, very historically sad moment if the United States were to preside over large-scale bloodletting, in other words, over a civil war, where the country is technically under the occupation of the United States, but in fact, we're not militarily in control. Now, what this means is a large-scale deployment of troops on the ground. This is really the choice that Americans are being asked to make now, although it's never couched in these terms. It also means that even gaining control is going to be very difficult. Iraq is a highly urbanized country. 40% of the population of Iraq lives in Baghdad itself. This is an enormous megalopolis. So casualties are going to be very high. The use of other forces, which has often been something that the United States has contemplated, both in Afghanistan and now in Iraq, is equally problematic. The Turkish military culture, as I know it, and maybe even Turks in general, have a virtually visceral hatred of the Kurds and of Arabs. Arabs are still seen in the Turkish imagination, certainly not among the educated groups, but in the general imagination, as betrayers of the Turkish mission, as the betrayers of the Ottoman Empire, as collaborators with colonial powers, and so on. I was going to read to you from my recent research notes about sort of just comments that people had made randomly in Istanbul, a very, very cosmopolitan city, that really would give you a sense of how bad an option it would be to send Turkish troops into Kurdistan or into any Arab country at all. So we're talking here about, just in terms of gaining military control, an enormous deployment of American or European soldiers, but the Europeans don't seem to be very excited about that prospect right now. In addition, the Turks, at least some of them, appear to have designs on the oil fields of Erbil and Kirkuk, something that's unacceptable not only to the Kurds, but would be obviously unacceptable to the other groups within Iraq as well. So the first problem is this problem of state building and consolidation. And one cannot overstress how costly this could be in lives and just how difficult it would be and how long-term a problem it would be. What sort of a government will the post-war Iraq have? This is the second problem. There's been a lot of talk about various kinds of strategies that could be used. I'd just like to tell you that the Iraqi National Congress, which is the group of leaders in opposition that have, most of them have been outside of the country for 20 years or more, are completely ineffective and completely disconnected from events on the ground. To look to them for leadership in this case would be tantamount to bringing back or trying to bring back the Hashemites into Iraq, although some people who really believe in conspiracy theories think that that's ultimately the aim that the United States has. So the third set of issues has to do with territory, which is Iraq going to become a federation? In other words, are these three parts of Iraq that have been essentially already carved out through a completely illegal, extra-legal creation of the no-fly zones, which are not sanctioned by the United Nations, by the way, is Iraq going to become a loose confederation? And if so, how can the regional designs of Iran and Turkey in particular be controlled? And would not such a federation simply set the stage for future conflict? I've been told that I'm going to turn into a pumpkin in 1 minute, so let me just quickly flag some other issues that perhaps we can take up during our discussion, which is the broader spillover into the region. Obviously, there is the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and of course there's the Palestinian-Arab problem as well. The question of whether or not there are going to be large-scale expulsions of Palestinians during the wartime, and whether or not this is going to fundamentally create instability in the borders between Jordan, Lebanon, and other neighboring countries. The second point I'd like to make in terms of the regional spillover is the fragility of Saudi Arabia. Just like Iraq, Saudi Arabia actually never became what we could call, as a term of art, a society. The princely elite is on its last legs in terms of the direct sons of King Abdulaziz. And after that, there are perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 people who could lay claim to the equal claim to the throne of Saudi Arabia. It's an unconsolidated society that if it were to fragment in a coup or something like that, or if there were to be large-scale instability, would also break down into regional and tribal rivalries. I've already mentioned Iran and the Shiites, Turkey and the problem of the Kurds. I should also mention that in Turkey right now you have a very fragile Islamic modernist party that is in charge. 95% of the people in Turkey apparently are against the war. And what the United States is essentially encouraging in that country, just in the last 3 or 4 days, it's happening right before our eyes, is for the military to twist the arm of the parliament and disavow the will of the Turkish people, and to go along with the United States' plan to station troops in Turkey. And I think that it's interesting that this is happening right in front of our eyes. We're not really hearing very much about it. In conclusion, the best outcome of a war in Iraq would be something like a controlled anarchy. And I had a number of other things to say, but let me just summarize them by saying that the terrorism that we're so afraid of and the international networks that we're so afraid of are a result of many different things: revolution in communications, the unintended consequences of economic liberalism in many of these very fractured societies, but it's also a result of statelessness, a result of areas where there really is no central authority. And a war with Iraq would result in practically an entire region that might be vulnerable to precisely this political state. And that's what we have to focus on in thinking about the outcome of the war. Thank you.
The war is coming at a critical time in the Muslim world and in the Middle East. One of the interesting assumptions about this war, which has been put forward by the administration, is that somehow regime change in Iraq is key to change across the Muslim world and in the Middle East. This point has been put forward over the course of the past year by many policymakers in Washington, Richard Perle, Paul Wolfowitz, and most recently by the president himself. The assumption being that somehow the Muslim world and the Middle East are in a sort of a stalemate, that they're stuck, and that there is need for a major push, a major sort of rupture that would move it along the course of development and democracy, and that Iraq is the lever for change that will accomplish that task. My inclination is that that's actually a wrong assumption, and it's an assumption that will have a lot to do with what kind of backlash we are to see in the Middle East. Far from being in a status, the Muslim world actually has been in the throes of some important change. If one were to look at Iran or Turkey in the past 5 or 6 years, or farther afield to Malaysia, Indonesia, or even to the Arab world, one sees profound changes. There's profound changes in the relationship between governments and their populations. There's a sort of a stability or a dialogue or processes of change that are happening between fundamentalist movements and their governments. These trends even continue despite the eruption that Al-Qaeda brought about. However, the war with Iraq sort of problematizes this, because the U.S., first of all, has chosen or has arrogated to itself the role of definer of Muslim futures, and as the one that will bring development, democracy, and the rest to the Middle East. And in some sense, it's actually chosen a country that actually was completely irrelevant to these changes. I mean, if there was one country in the past 10 years in which none of the changes that are important to the future of the Muslim world were happening, was Iraq. And it's actually somewhat baffling why Iraq would be at all relevant in terms of the changes that one would like to see in the Muslim world. In fact, rather than bringing about change, positive change, the war is likely to interfere with the change that has already been ongoing for a variety of reasons. Not only because this may be the wrong country to pick on to change, that Iraq, for better or for worse, even with the best of intentions, is not likely to be the catalyst because it just doesn't have the ingredients that requires it to play that role. But it goes beyond Iraq in the sense that the consequences of the war, regardless of whether the war is long or short, bloody or swift, are such that will interfere with the changes that are afoot in the Muslim world. The United States, in all likelihood, will become a Middle East actor. It will have to give up its position of being an observer from afar. It will be an actor in the region. In the least, as I said, it will be a definer of Muslim futures. And it will have to rely on stability in the region in order to accomplish its goals. The needs for stability will mean that it will have to rely increasingly on authoritarian regimes in order to be able to manage the situation on the ground. In fact, far from Iraq being the first domino in a set of democratic changes to come about in the Middle East, most likely the necessity of stability will mean that we would have to rely on those governments that can bring order and be able to contain the spread of instability and statelessness of the kind that Dr. Chaudhry was mentioning. The United States war against Iraq is also likely to affect the stability that, or the structure of the discussions that were happening between various regimes and their oppositions, which in most cases are Islamic oppositions. Focus of political mobilization can shift from public anger and frustration against regimes, against economic stagnation, against domestic issues, towards the role that the U.S. plays in the region. Events such as Al-Qaeda, as important as they are, they're sort of marginal to much of Islamic fundamentalism, whose focus has been on regime change within the countries in which it operates. And the war can have the effect of making the United States and its presence in the region the problematic around which these forces will coalesce. We can already look to what's happening in Indonesia and Pakistan as signals of what is to come. Pakistan, after the events of September 11, was encouraged by the United States to cooperate with the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan and with cracking down against Al-Qaeda. And the consequence actually was a very strong coalition of extremists as well as previously moderate Islamic forces, which had a very strong showing in the last elections in Pakistan. Similarly, in Indonesia, greater pressure has actually produced a much stronger Islamic opposition. And in both of these countries, Islamic oppositions who were previously focused on local governments are increasingly turning their attention on the United States as the quote-unquote enemy around which to mobilize, to recruit, and to gather strength. And in particular cases like Iran, this is somewhat alarming. What is happening in Iran is perhaps far more important to the future of the Muslim world than what will happen in Iraq at this point in time. This is a country who's gone through a revolution. It's in the throes of change. There is strong secular liberal opposition in Iran that is demanding change. But the rapidly changing geopolitical structure in the Middle East is having a tremendous impact on the march towards openness in Iran. Iran is increasingly feeling that it's being sandwiched between two U.S. posts in the region, between Afghanistan and Iraq. That is increasingly shifting the direction of internal political discussion away from liberalism and openness towards nationalism, towards protection of national assets, towards preservation, not only of regime preservation, but of preservation of national integrity and the like. And the last thing that one would like to see in Iran is that the very promise of the process of change that has been afoot, that would be stalled as a consequence of the war. The long and short of it essentially is that although one may hope for a rapid war that will bring many good things to the region, the way in which, as Dr. Chaudhry mentioned, the war is being perceived in the region, the very fact that we are focusing on a country that in of itself will not necessarily have an impact on the larger issues of religion, secularism, development in the region, and is likely actually to impact how those issues are being discussed in those countries, is one of the major pitfalls that need to be debated.
Before I begin, though, I needed to make a disclaimer. My remarks are my own, and I'm not an official DOD spokesman. But what makes me credible to discuss this topic? I asked to put up the map that's up on the screen because I spent a great deal of my time in that body of water that you see, which is labeled on the chart as the Persian Gulf, but the Arabian Gulf is what the area is more aptly called. My first exposure to this region was in 1987 during the Iraq-Iran War. I was the executive officer on board a destroyer that escorted commercial oil tankers from Kuwait through the Strait of Hormuz and out to the Indian Ocean. During that particular time frame, I was part of an attack on the Iranian platforms that they were using to attack those oil tankers with. That probably didn't make a lot of the news that day because at that exact same day in the United States was when the stock market crashed in 1987. I was back in the area after Desert Storm in the 1995 timeframe as commanding officer of a destroyer that enforced UN sanctions against Iraq. These sanctions were imposed in 1991 after the Gulf War. My role was to conduct maritime interception ops, boarding ships that were illegally smuggling oil from Iraq. The sanctions allowed a certain amount of oil that Saddam Hussein was to use to feed his people, medicine, etc. He didn't always choose to use that income for those purposes, however. We were on our way back home in August of 1995. We were ordered back into the Gulf when Saddam Hussein's son-in-law left Iraq and was granted asylum in Jordan. We were relieved prior to Christmas, and shortly after we got back here to San Diego, Saddam Hussein granted a pardon to his son-in-law. The son-in-law returned to Iraq on 20 February. He was killed on 23 February. I returned to the Arabian Gulf in 1999 after President Clinton ordered Tomahawk strikes against Iraq in Operation Desert Fox. He ordered these strikes because the inspectors were removed due to Iraq's non-cooperation in complying with UN resolutions. Throughout this deployment, I was the Commodore in charge of 19 ships. I was on board USS Constellation, enforcing the same UN sanctions I enforced in 1995 as a ship's commanding officer. These 19 ships included coalition partners from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. I am currently in charge of training the sailors and Marines on board our ships, subs, and aircrafts that operate in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and the Arabian Gulf. As you can imagine, the Arabian Gulf is a large part of our war game scenarios and our curriculum. Today we have approximately 75 ships in the region, alongside with 65 ships from 14 different countries ready to support potential combat operations. I stress the word potential because there are other options available. Saddam could finally choose to live up to the 16 previous UN resolutions, the most recent being Resolution 1441, adopted in November 2002, which called for serious consequences if Saddam failed to disarm. To disarm, he must account for his stocks of mustard gas, VX nerve agent, sarin gas, anthrax, and other biological warfare agents that were in his possession at the end of the Gulf War. I refer you to the Hans Blix 167-page supplement report for further information on what Saddam Hussein needs to do. Another option for Saddam Hussein is to take advantage of the idea put forth by the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar, and go into exile. There could also be an internal coup, but as the death of his son-in-law demonstrates, anyone thought to be anti-Saddam Hussein has a short life expectancy in Iraq. War is the last resort, and is a serious consequence mentioned in UN Resolution 1441. Let's say war does occur. What will happen in post-war Iraq, which is the topic of this panel? President Bush recently cited the examples of what occurred in Japan and Germany after World War II. Two recent examples that can provide insight are Kosovo and Afghanistan. In Kosovo, after the successful NATO bombing campaign in 1998, and as an aside, President Clinton did not go to the UN Security Council for authorization for fear of a veto by Russia. We established a reconstruction force after that bombing campaign, and the current Kosovo force is a NATO-led international group made up from 37 NATO and non-NATO countries responsible for establishing and maintaining security in Kosovo. The objectives of this force is to establish and maintain a secure environment in Kosovo, including public safety, in order to monitor and verify when necessary the compliance and the agreements that ended that particular conflict, and to provide assistance to the UN mission in Kosovo and other international non-government agencies. So far, they have arrested hundreds of suspected criminals, confiscated quantities of weapons and ammunition, and restored the overall security and stability of Kosovo. Their presence has allowed more than 775,000 refugees and displaced people to come back to Kosovo and feel secure again. A constant drop in the rate of murder, arson, and looting is a positive achievement by that force. This international force's involvement can be found in a variety of additional sectors, such as public works and utilities, construction, transportation, railway operations, mine clearance, border security, fire services, protection of international workers, food distribution, removal of unexploded ordnance, mine awareness education, and medical services, just to name a few. The presence of crowds of people walking safely on the streets, doing their daily business or shopping, or simply buying a local newspaper printed without censorship provides further testament to the achievements of this rebuilding effort in Kosovo. Afghanistan. Military operations in Afghanistan were conducted as part of the global war on terrorism and led to regime change when the Taliban was forced out of power. 48 nations are now involved in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, working closely with international, non-government agencies doing the exact same thing that's happening and working in Kosovo. They are providing security, feeding and clothing refugees, repairing and building infrastructure, providing much-needed medical care and other human assistance as needed, humanitarian assistance as needed. The goal this coalition force has is to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a haven for terrorists. They want to help the Afghan people rebuild their country after almost a quarter of a century of turmoil. This help has allowed women to return to their professions. It's allowed tens of thousands of children to go back to school. It has provided the stability and security that has given a representative government in Afghanistan an opportunity to succeed. With these examples as background, let's examine what might happen if war does occur and Saddam Hussein is no longer in power. To quote President Bush, rebuilding Iraq will require a sustained commitment from many nations, including our own. We will remain in Iraq as long as necessary and not a day more. The first to benefit from a free Iraq would be the Iraqi people. Today they live in scarcity and fear under a dictator who has brought them nothing but war, misery, and torture. Their lives and their freedom matters little to Saddam Hussein. Bringing stability and unity to a free Iraq will not be easy, Yet that is no excuse to leave the Iraqi regime's torture chambers and poison labs in operation. Any future the Iraqi people choose for themselves will be better than the nightmare world that Saddam Hussein has chosen for them. We'll make sure that Iraq's 55,000 food distribution sites are stocked and open as soon as possible. We are now moving into place emergency rations to feed the hungry. The United States and Great Britain are providing tens of millions of dollars to the UN High Commission on Refugees and to such groups as the World Food Program and UNICEF to provide emergency aid to the Iraqi people. We will also lead in carrying out the urgent and dangerous work of destroying chemical and biological weapons. We will deliver medical care to the sick. We will provide security against those who try to spread chaos or settle scores or threaten the territorial integrity of Iraq. We will seek to protect Iraq's natural resources from sabotage by a dying regime, ensure these resources are used for the benefit of the owners, the Iraqi people. Just as in Kosovo and Afghanistan, the military will play a key role in the rebuilding process. The key is to assist the Iraqi people in establishing a representative government that does not produce weapons of mass destruction and does not support terrorism. Let us all hope that the threat of force pressures Saddam Hussein to fully disarm and that war can be avoided. If our commander-in-chief decides that war is necessary, the U.S. military stands ready to accomplish that mission. We are prepared for war, but we pray for peace. Thank you.
My focus today is narrow compared to the remarks you've already heard. If I were to put a map up here, it would not be a map of the Middle East. It would be a list of the national income and product accounts of the United States. But I don't wish to test your patience. To state the obvious, war in Iraq will pose severe economic problems and challenges for the American economy. That's the burden of my remarks today. I find curious and disturbing that for the months in which we have prepared for this war, and in which there has been much political discussion about whether it should or should not take place, whether its consequences will or will not be good ones, there has been a virtual silence about the economic consequences of this conflict, should it come, and indeed the very peculiar ways in which the government has or has not addressed those consequences. Many of these are, of course, directly related to the costs of the war. More about those in a moment. But perhaps the most severe have to do with the indirect costs, the opportunity costs, as economists like to call them, of waging war rather than doing something else. These opportunity costs, as I call them, I think are best epitomized by the federal budget that has been proposed and that now sits before the United States Congress. Much like his father, George Bush the Elder, during the Gulf War of the early 1990s, George Bush the Younger seeks to wage war, if necessary, in the Near East while remaining wedded to an extraordinarily conservative set of domestic economic policies. And it's this conservative agenda that is the main component of what I call the economic war at home that will parallel the war in Iraq. Consider the general outlines of the problem. In the past 2 years at the federal level, we have gone from what was a projected budget surplus of a bit over $5.5 trillion over 10 years to what is now projected conservatively to be a deficit of $2.1 trillion in the same time period. There's every reason to believe it will be worse. The interest costs of carrying this accumulated debt alone could squander the entire surplus of the Social Security Fund, for example. Now, President Bush blames the current recession and, in his words, a war we did not choose. Now, this is a rather disingenuous declaration, for it assumes that a war against terrorism and a war against Iraq must be fought. It also assumes that if fought, it must be fought in a certain way. And most of all, in my mind, it assumes that if fought, it must nonetheless be yoked to a particular set of economic policies at home. Now, September 11th changed everything, we're told. But there's one thing it did not change: the commitment of the current presidential administration to implementing a dramatic reduction of the taxes imposed on the wealthiest segments of the American population. Of the sum $8.8 trillion lost in projected federal revenues over the next decade, fully half of these derive from the president's tax cut proposal. I might add that this tax cut proposal is also linked to the suggestion that levies on the unearned income of the wealthiest Americans also be reduced, and that estate taxes on the wealthy be fully eliminated, so that this wealth may be transferred from generation to generation without hindrance. The ironies and the tragedies of this economic situation are obvious, I think. For the first time in the nation's history, with the possible exception of the Gulf War a decade ago, the federal government seeks to wage war while restricting fiscal spending and thus further skewing the distribution of incomes and wealth at home. One striking example: recently, the president pushed members of his own party in the Congress, in the majority, to vote down spending increases for homeland security projects at the nation's ports and nuclear power plants. Now, the French, by contrast, whose government many Americans these days now love to hate, defend each one of their nuclear power facilities with an anti-aircraft battery. We cannot afford to do so. The problem, however, goes far beyond simply one of military preparedness and security alone. Fiscal discipline and stability are also now jeopardized by the government's military strategies in the Near East, of course, and elsewhere in the world. The U.S. military budget will hit roughly $400 billion next fiscal year, a sum larger than all of the other military budgets in the world combined. That figure, by the way, does not include any clear estimate of the actual costs of war in Iraq should it come. From a low of $30 billion to a high of $100 billion, estimates of these direct costs of the war are literally all over the map. Military spending overall today is $70 billion higher than it was 2 years ago. It's about 13% higher than the average annual expenditure during the height of the Cold War. Now, back then, the United States faced a formidable opponent, the Soviet Union. Today, the United States stands alone as a superpower, threatened by a terrorist network, or more than one to be sure, but facing no large armies, fleets, or air forces deployed anywhere near its borders. How strange it is that the largest single line item in the proposed Pentagon allocation for next fiscal year is almost $10 billion for a missile defense system, a weapon that has yet to be proven in the field, to be deployed against a threat that by any credible evidence does not exist. One might also note that these dramatic increases in military spending are all being proposed in the absence of a full reckoning of the intelligence and national security failures that led to the September 11th tragedies themselves. Billions of dollars expended in so-called black budgets. Nevertheless, the national security agencies of the United States were caught completely off guard on that fall morning 2 years ago. As I like to mention to community groups I visit with, remember that the only American to date to fully infiltrate the Taliban organization in Afghanistan before September 11th was a young man named John Walker Lind, who did so at a cost of $0 to the American taxpayer. But I digress. What are some of the other examples of this economic war at home? Well, one thing we've seen already: discretionary budget cuts forced by the Bush tax and military spending proposals. In education, Pell Grants, an obvious example. In environmental protection. In aid to the states, virtually all of whom, especially California, are awash in red ink. In community development and low-income housing programs. In school lunch programs, just to name a few. In the case of the states, their increased fiscal burdens also derive from the need to enhance their own security measures, something the federal government has been less than willing and less than able to support at the levels required. At a meeting of state governors with the president about a week ago, President Bush said there was no more money to aid the states. They were, in his words, now on their own. But the president misspoke. One proposal in the works to aid the states is to have Congress legislate further so that states may eliminate more benefits and impose stricter eligibility guidelines for Medicaid, the state equivalent of Medicare, so that more beneficiaries may be struck from the rolls and the cost of Medicaid to the states reduced. There are an infinite array of other examples, most recently in Oregon, just this past Wednesday. Expenditures to purchase medications for the indigent, for psychotics, drug addicts, the indigent poor. It has been proposed that these expenditures be eliminated, although now there's a counterattack underway in the state legislature. In Portland, Oregon, public school officials announced that 5 weeks of the school calendar may be cut for a lack of funds. Here in San Diego Unified School District just announced yesterday that the cuts it anticipates imposing per student will be the largest in the state to deal with the shortfalls here. Some other examples of these problems. At the federal level, pursuit of a Medicare reform plan that, deftly cloaked with a proposal to include a prescription drug benefit, would force most elderly into managed care programs. Pursuit of the privatization of Social Security funds, an astounding proposal given the recent performance of financial markets. A proposal to cut $500 million from community policing programs that have been proven in their ability to reduce crime and related difficulties at the local level. Then there is the matter of the economic impacts of war itself above and beyond these economic war measures at home. The fiscal impacts I've already mentioned. The higher interest rates that federal borrowing will impose on us as the costs of the war increase will further worsen the recession we now struggle with. The inflationary momentum imposed by higher and higher energy prices as the international oil economy is disrupted will also make themselves felt. Crude oil futures 2 days ago hit their highest levels in over 2 years. Actual oil prices now stand at their highest levels since Iraq invaded Kuwait 12 years ago. Some other examples. Automobile sales have been remarkably weak in the past couple of months. This despite an array of sales incentives to encourage skittish consumers. General Motors has announced its intention to cut production by 10% in the next 3 months. Manufacturing activity is remarkably deteriorated since February. Despite increases in construction spending and even lower mortgage rates, consumers are proving themselves skittish with respect to the purchasing of housing. And most of all, I think, investors overall have shown themselves to be remarkably timid and reluctant to commit their funds. The steady decline in the Dow Jones and in other major stock market indices are much remarked upon in the press. What is perhaps less noticed is the also steady decline in trading volumes. Less and less shares traded, which indicates that more and more investors are sitting on their hands. 3 final points. Another indirect economic consequence of this war, should it come, has gone almost totally unremarked. The economic blowback effects of our policies in the Near East. In Arab states, there is today a growing discussion of a boycott of American exports, and foreign capital in general has begun fleeing U.S. stocks and bonds. The impacts of these developments could dwarf those I have already described. Indeed, with respect to the flight of foreign capital, this process will only make even more difficult the financing of a war effort should it become long and costly. What of post-war reconstruction? There are no apparent plans in place to rebuild Iraq, let alone a strategy to finance those plans. How would there be a financial plan given the fiscal strategies already proposed by the Bush government? How can a government cut taxes, reduce its revenues, and yet pursue a so-called Marshall Plan in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or elsewhere? President Karzai of Afghanistan has been pleading with the United States, quote, not to forget Afghanistan should Iraq happen. This all suggests that a meaningful economic plan for post-war reconstruction does not, and at the moment cannot exist. I have no solutions to these problems, but I'll close by sharing one that was offered in the pages of the Union Tribune earlier this week. A woman from San Diego wrote a letter to the editors of the UT, and she suggested that one way to solve our local economic problems in California might be as follows. California should immediately declare its independence from the United States. Having done so, Sacramento should then vote its opposition to the war, then await the flood of federal money to persuade it to participate in the war. Who knows? Maybe this is one way we could keep down UC fees. I jest, but my point should be clear. We don't know when or if a war will begin in the Middle East, but I think the economic war at home has already begun. Thank you.